Can you hear me?
Perfect.
Yeah.
Now I just have to turn around I don't know why my lock screen always goes on and then
If not, I have to be like this the whole time.
let's see if we can fix that. Yeah, there we go.
Get it? Amazing. Okay. How are you?
Okay, better with AirPods or without?
No, you're good. We can hear you
Okay.
good. Yeah, perfect. Okay. So let me just check the tech. So we have the AI, we have the recording, and we're supposed to stream this live. So I think it is already streaming. Yes, it should be already streaming. Okay, good. Very good. Well, welcome, Michal. Hi.
Hi.
I'm so happy to have you on the Jewish Women Entrepreneurs and Leaders podcast. We already had an interview a while ago on this podcast, but as we know, not only in our lives but also in our country, a lot of things change very fast. So I'm very excited to have you again so that you can share the amazing work that you're doing. I'm going to start by sharing your bio for people who don't know you, and then we're going to dive right in asking a lot. We have a lot of questions, but we'll try to keep it short because we know that people have busy lives. But thank you so much for being here, Michal.
And thank you very much for having me and for everybody who's joined.
Amazing. Thank you. So, a little bit more about Michal. Michal Cotler-Wunsh is Israel's special envoy for combating anti-Semitism and a senior policy and strategy advisor. She's a former member of the Knesset, the Israeli parliament, where she served as the first Knesset liaison to the issue of the International Criminal Court and co-founded the Interparliamentary Task Force to combat online anti-Semitism. Michal's work focuses on anti-Semitism, international law, human rights, and Zionism. She works with Jewish Federations of North America, Nefesh B'Nefesh, and Reichman University in Herzliya. She also serves as a trustee for the Rabbi Sachs Legacy, and she lives in Ra'anana today in Israel with her husband and their 4 children. Obviously, your biography is much longer than that, and whoever is interested in hearing everything you've done, is welcome to check online. But we wanted to give the highlights that we wanted to address today. And the first question I want to ask you, Michal, is actually related to the fact that we had an interview in the past, and before we can talk about before and after October 7th. This is really for everybody, whether in Israel or around the world. This has been really a game changer for everyone. And I want to ask you personally, how has your personal life and your professional mission has changed since October 7th?
Well, I'll say devastatingly, and actually you read some parts of my bio that are a continuation of what I've done for decades. And in many ways, what happened on October the 7th was not only a part of the urgency that served my mission up until October the 7th, but of course turned up that sense of urgency on and since October the 7th, because what in many ways I researched, wrote about, legislated, or was activist legislators, activists, and so on, as you've described, in order to be able to not just predict what was coming, but attempt to prevent it, in fact, happened on October the 7th. And so it's not just the sense of urgency, but I'll share in some ways a sense of failure in having not been successful at sounding the alarms loudly enough, and a sense of heightened responsibility at being able to underscore or diagnose precisely how we arrived not only at October 7th, the attack of barbarism on civilization in Israel that murdered and butchered and abducted and raped. And I'm going to say, and abducted is a very important piece of it, because in the last 10 years, part of what maybe wasn't mentioned is that I've been at the legal forefront of the case and cause to return deceased soldier Hadar Golden, who remains in Hamas captivity, who was abducted after he was killed in the aftermath or shortly after an internationally brokered international humanitarian ceasefire came into effect. So everything conflating, and of course that intersecting with, over time, including my own doctoral research on regulation of speech on university campuses, understanding what it was that was happening in academia, understanding from an international law perspective that we were losing the international institutions, if you will, that were created and entrusted to uphold and protect the international rules-based order, so that, and we meet in the days between Yom HaShoah and Yom HaZikaron, Yom HaAtzmaut, so that never again. And so the sense of urgency, which you could probably hear in my voice, that guided everything that I did until October the 7th, became only more heightened. The sense of responsibility that included, in fact, getting on planes literally days after October the 7th from our very best friend's son's Shiva, in order to be able to bring a bit of solace in the understanding of how we arrived at that moment, so that we can prepare for what it is that we need to do in the aftermath, and in anticipation of what I knew would come in the tsunami of anti-Semitism across spaces and places around the world. And of course, the online piece, which you mentioned, was a big component of what we saw. And so, yes, the intersection of the personal, the professional, the legislative, the academic intersected very personally for me, but it isn't at all about me. It's not just about the national sense of urgency for the state of Israel and for the Jewish people, but in many ways what I perceive as an existential moment for all who cherish life and liberty, for our shared humanity, if you will, because as I said, that is what October the 7th showed and exposed. It was the attack of barbarism on civilization, if you will, in many ways sounding the alarm. At the time when I spoke at the UN 1 month after October the 7th, I made clear that October the 7th was the Kristallnacht of our time. And the question was how we would respond to the Kristallnacht in our time. And I'm sure we'll delve into that response.
Yeah, of course. And it's unfortunately, it's something that you've been saying, meaning like you're saying that you've seen the signs before October 7th. You're not the only one, unfortunately, saying that. It doesn't make us feel better, but you know, it's just a reality that that a lot of people that were in positions of power have said that, you know, there were signs, and that there were, you know, things that were showing that October 7th was going to happen. And I know that you've dealt with anti-Semitism even before October 7th. So you've had that already, you were already raising the red flag, and you were already, you know, screaming to whoever can hear it. But I want to ask you, how do you see exactly, because you've had that experience and you've had that knowledge before October 7th, but how do you see that anti-Semitism has evolved or changed? You know, is there a before and after October 7th, and what are the most alarming trends, according to you, with this anti-Semitism that we're going through right now, post October 7th?
So I'll try and make this as clear as possible, although I lean on some sort of legalese, but it's really not for lawyers, in order to be able to understand what we saw on and since October the 7th, and what makes me so concerned. And it's the following. In very many ways, the best way for me to describe anti-Semitism as we see it raging around the world now is that it is a symptom of a raging war front to demonize and delegitimize and apply double standards to the Jew among nations. Now, that did not start on October the 7th. October the 7th was fueled by this strain of hatred. And you mentioned anti-Semitism. It's very important because it enables a very good looking glass. As anti-Semitism is the oldest hatred in the world, and as Jews, an ancient people, have in many ways had been told, commanded to remember what it is that we are experiencing, there's an added sort of sense of responsibility, I'll say, to diagnose what has been the mutation of anti-Semitism, not just over thousands of years, but as I said, in the more modern sort of version of anti-Semitism. And I begin sort of this strain of anti-Semitism that became so mainstream and normalized, that's the alarm that's ringing, as the understanding that the new strain of anti-Semitism is anti-Zionism, right? The denial of Israel's very right to exist in any borders. October 7th made that very clear. It wasn't about borders. It wasn't about where is it 1967 or where the border should run. It was about 1948. Does the state of Israel have a right to exist anywhere? And in fact, the chants that greet me on every campus in which I speak at and on the streets, from the river to the sea, or we don't want no Jew state, we want all of 48, make very clear precisely the intent of October the 7th, but how we got there is in decades, and I often begin it with a 1975 Zionism is Racism UN resolution. Soviet propaganda passed in the UN in 1975. We're about to mark 50 years to Zionism is Racism. That resolution passed in the UN that is alive and well on university campuses, online, on the streets, in the name of progress. Zionism is Racism, blood libel #1, that began in this unconventional war for hearts and minds to turn the legitimacy of Zionism as a progressive national liberation movement anchored in Zionist identity of Jews for thousands of years that prayed and yearned and longed to return to Zion, and that cannot just shed their Zionist pound of flesh to be a good human being. But if you understand that anti-Semitism mutates by latching onto the guiding social construct of each time, religion, science, and the secular religion of our times, human rights, then you understand why Zionism is racism, even the use of those words, hijacking in the international institutions created and entrusted to uphold, promote, and protect an international rules-based order, was the opening shot of this unconventional war for public opinion after a series of conventional wars failed to annihilate the state of Israel from 1948 to 1973, after the state of Israel, to which, of course, Jews returned after thousands of years of exile and persecution. After the series of those wars, this unconventional war begins in 1975. And to fast forward, I would say the next sort of pinnacle, if you will, of this war, blood libelous pinnacle, of course, is the 2001 Durban Conference Against Racism that turns into an anti-Semitic hate fest, after which Israel is actually compared with an apartheid state. So Zionism is Racism, blood libel #1. Blood libel #2 is already 24 years of peddling of Israel's an apartheid state, and we have to remind ourselves, for 24 years, there have been Israel Apartheid Weeks held across campuses around the world, all over North America. In most US campuses, Israel Apartheid Weeks have taken place. That means there are 24 years of graduates that have experienced blood libel #1, Zionism is Racism, blood libel #2, Israel's an apartheid state, and the urgency. And I think that that's the turning point, if you will, that you asked me about post-October the 7th, is actually the hijacking and the weaponization of another legal construct in another international law institution, and that is hijacking and weaponizing genocide itself. Genocide, a term coined by Raphael Lemkin that has a very clear definition, whose entire family, by the way, was annihilated in Auschwitz, and alongside Lauterpacht, created who coined the term crimes against humanity, coined the term genocide, and then that term genocide, he devoted his life for the Convention for the Prevention and Punishment of the Crime of Genocide, of which, of course, Israel was one of the first signatories. Well, that convention, that term genocide, the Holocaust itself, if you will, hijacked and weaponized to seat the state of Israel, the Jew among nations, on the dock of the accused in the International Court of Justice, intended to be a court of last resort by none other than South Africa, in order to be able to actually not only seat it on the dock of the accused to accuse it of genocide, but in fact to do so while it is defending itself from openly declared intent to perpetrate genocide following the war crimes and crimes against humanity of October the 7th. And so the turning point comes at this sort of final moment where there is this normalization, but more devastatingly, if you will, if that can even be imagined, than the butchery and the murder and the rape and the abduction of October the 7th are the responses to October the 7th. That, to me, is what must sound the alarms. Because what the responses to October the 7th, responses of silence, me too, unless you're a Jew, responses of denial that began on October the 7th, even while the savage perpetrators of the atrocities live streamed what they were doing. Denial began, including online. Responses of justification. Judith Butler, whose textbooks I studied in law school, explaining that rape is armed resistance. And of course, responses of the attack of Jews and Zionists, because you need not be a Jew to be the target of this strain of anti-Semitism, that is anti-Zionism. You need just believe in Israel's right to exist. Well, those responses have mainstreamed anti-Semitism. So I'm sorry for the long answer, but the most concerning thing that we have seen in the 18 months since October the 7th as a raging multi-front war, because it's not just the October 7th massacre, of course. It was the opening shot of a multi-front war on 7 fronts in Israel. But again, I'll say this being the 8th front that continues raging without ceasefires, that demonizes and delegitimizes and applies double standards to the state of Israel, justifying, if you will, in this mainstreamed form of anti-Semitism, this anti-Zionist form, or normalizing anti-Semitism to the extent that it has actually unleashed all the strains of anti-Semitism, this ever-mutating hatred. And I would be remiss if I didn't mention in this context, underscoring the importance of the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance definition of anti-Semitism, the result of a very long democratic process that actually in the aftermath of the 2001 Durban Conference Against Racism that I noted before, understood that it is international law and human rights that have been hijacked and weaponized, and therefore have to be added to the long list of examples. There are 11 sort of strains of anti-Semitism listed in the IRA, in the example section. And therefore, all strains of anti-Semitism have to be identified, if you will, if we're going to be able to combat this viral, lethal hatred that mutates. Because as we all know, post-COVID, if a new strain of a virus develops, of course, the older strains don't die out. But if a new strain develops, then we can't very well combat the virus if we don't have an antidote. And that's the moment that we're in around the world, from Sydney, Australia, to Montreal, Canada, to Amsterdam. Everywhere that you look, this tsunami of normalized, mainstreamed anti-Semitism that isn't coded anymore, that isn't hidden anymore, that directly targets Jews and Zionists, supporters of Israel, and those that perceive to be supporters of Israel because they're visible Jews. Whether they are or they aren't, nobody asks that question. That is the most concerning part as we sort of reflect on remembrance in these days of never again, and the understanding that never again is not about preventing the past. It's about remembering the past so we identify the threat in the present in order to be able to prevent the recurrence of atrocities.
Yeah. I mean, you apologize for a long answer, and yet it's the unfortunately, it's the element and what happened in history that makes for this long answer. I mean, you and I would have loved to have a very short answer for this question and just, being able to condense this. But I think your overview of everything that happened in the last 50 years, like you mentioned, since 75. While I was listening to you, every word, I was also understanding that it's taking another shape and form because of social media and because it is accessible to everyone. And if in 1975 there were a few people that knew about what was happening, today we are all witnesses, just by opening our social media, that it is happening to everyone, to any person who is potentially Jewish or potentially, showing up as a Jew or a defender of Israel. And that's what is bringing me to my next question, because you were the co-founder of the Interparliamentary Task Force to Combat Online Antisemitism. And I want to ask you, and I know that there are, algorithm and startups that are working on defending, having, comments and AI and all this technology around, fighting anti-Semitism online. But, from your work, I want to ask you, what are the policies and the tools that you think that we can really use to counter hate speech online? Because that is really what every citizen and every Jew in the world is potentially a victim of. And I'm not saying it's worse, because everything is bad, but it's just has become that it's entering our internal houses, our mind. It's we're feeling the anti-Semitism even if we're not walking down the street with a kippah, or it's just like online is everywhere. So as policies, what are you suggesting, or what do you think can be a solution for that?
So just to be clear, that task force was created in the aftermath, and just to sort of continue what I was saying before, October the 7th didn't happen overnight, right? It happened over, as I said, over decades, including the online piece. And actually, the reason that I founded or initiated and co-founded that task force was because during COVID, there was this huge increase in anti-Semitism, online anti-Semitism, right? There was this crazy, sort of scary virus that was traveling around the world, threatening, to infect all of us. And simultaneously, the virus of anti-Semitism was increasing online in a way that was dumbfounding to most that don't understand the mutation of anti-Semitism and that it mutates precisely as a virus. So there were hashtags like COVID-19, and there were, like COVID-48 instead of COVID-19, COVID-48 insinuating, of course, the founding of the year of the State of Israel, conflating it with COVID. And there were all kinds of online usages, including on TikTok, including on Instagram, that were creating this virality and the peddling of propaganda in a much more effective platform than ever envisioned before, right? And so that is actually, in fact, what led to the initiation and the co-founding of this Interparliamentary Task Force to Combat Online Antisemitism and hearings. I began with hearings in Knesset before I founded the task force, with Twitter at the time, Twitter and Facebook and Google and TikTok, and understanding in many ways what legislators don't understand about the way that we are addressing and asking questions. I was then a legislator. It's not just about legislators, but the general public, as you said, the way we consume information, about legislators, and about the way that we view what it is that happens online in principle. The understanding that there is an algorithm and that it is not transparent, that your echo chamber and my echo chamber look completely different in whatever digital platform we're inhabiting. That is something that actually is alarming, because it means that this polarizing, fragmentizing reality in which each of us is actually consuming different information that's targeted to us, was alarming, not just vis-a-vis anti-Semitism. We understand that in so many contexts. In fact, as a legislator, I saw it in many other contexts that targets youth. It was COVID. And of course, all youngsters were encouraged to be, whatever it was that they were doing, going to school online. Well, they were also being targeted for whatever it is, from electronic cigarettes to other, more dangerous behaviors and addictive behaviors and so on. The understanding that what happens online does not remain online and has real world impact, but that we have not actually utilized our understanding of regulating the real world in order to be able to translate it to the online, leaves me with one most important, and if you remember nothing else I said today, then it's this. The most important demand that we need to be making of our legislators, of the social media companies, and in the meantime, in the way that we consume information, is transparency. Transparency of algorithm. Transparency of user. There are very negative agents that are utilizing algorithms in order to peddle information, disinformation, misinformation online, not just anti-Semitism, but definitely anti-Semitism. We have proof that countries, Iran, China, are utilizing the online spaces to peddle propaganda, anti-Semitic propaganda, and in many ways are actually sowing the hatred that we see, not just online, as I said, offline, on the streets, on campuses, and so on. So transparency is the key. Transparency of algorithm, transparency of policies, transparency of the implementation of policies. In the hearings that we held with the online platforms that, as I mentioned, began in Knesset, but then we continued as I formed the task force, because the idea was that we're each having geographic conversation with the platforms, but there's no geography to the platforms. They transcend borders. They're all over. And so we are actually demanding to have an international conversation, if you will, or at the time we did, as legislators from the US, from Canada, from the UK, from Australia, from Israel. It grew actually over time. Other countries joined, and it was always bipartisan or multi-partisan. It's critical that we understand that politicization of anti-Semitism only fuels it. And in many ways, that task force continued in its deliberations with the online platforms and its discussions with the online platforms, and in many ways in being able to hold them to account, with demanding, in addition to what I said, transparency, and until such time that we manage that, with demanding certain things be clear with regards to anti-Semitism. For example, I mentioned the IRA, the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance definition of anti-Semitism. You can't identify something unless you define it. and you can't combat it unless you identify it. Well, we have a definition, and it's not only relevant in offline spaces, in university campuses, on streets, in international institutions. It's relevant in online spaces. Anti-Semitism has a definition. So if the supreme leader of Iran peddles his anti-Semitic hate regularly, you need just look at his X account, by threatening to annihilate the Zionist cancerous state, that is the state of Israel, that is anti-Semitism according to the IRA. And in many, many ways, including my engagement with the platforms, it's not about removal of speech. It's actually about a flagging anti-Semitic hate speech, as you would any other hate speech, and say, you now have to click through, for example, if you're engaged in Holocaust denial, which regularly online, there are individuals who engage in Holocaust denial, you will have to click through and understand not only what Holocaust denial is, but what the Holocaust was. As I said, this conversation began around TikTok with teens that don't know what the Holocaust was. And so in many ways, there is a much deeper conversation that needs to be had. It needs to be had in a much more sort of international forum, because there's a global element to the online reality. It needs to understand deeply that what happens online does not remain online, but translates to very real world harm and violence and harassment and bullying, as we have seen over the last 18 months. And the online piece challenges us in a way that perhaps in the past we weren't as familiar with. But I want to say it's just a new medium, right? When you look at Nazi propaganda, we just marked Yom HaShoah. You look at Nazi propaganda, what you see in Nazi propaganda is the systematic dehumanization, delegitimization, and double standard applied to the Jew, the individual Jew. Well, if all that's happened is that anti-Semitism morphed to dehumanize, delegitimize, and apply double standards to the Jew among nations, including in online spaces, not only in online spaces, to justify, if you will, and normalize this lethal hate, that then we have seen the worst of what it justifies and legitimates, right? When you dehumanize and delegitimize and apply double standards to. And that is the moment that we are at, from my perspective, existentially so, as I said, in Israel for sure, and for Jews around the world. But I'm going to argue, as I always quote the late Rabbi Sachs, that anti-Semitism historically is the most reliable sign of a major threat to humanity and to freedom and to the dignity of difference. So this is definitely not just about us.
Definitely, definitely not. And it's so important that we remind this for ourselves, but also for everyone else who is not necessarily a Jew or not connected to Israel. This is definitely a very alarming sign for humanity. And as you know, we are in the Jewish Women Entrepreneurs podcast, so we speak a lot about women's leadership, and we speak about the special place that women have in the world, just like we speak about the special place that Jews have in the world. There is also a special place that women, and I want to ask you, as a former member of the Knesset, as a special envoy, you are a woman, and I want to ask you first of all, if you feel that you're navigating a male-dominated space. Do you feel like it is male-dominated? But I also want to ask you, what do you think the strength, the special strength that women bring to the table when we speak about diplomacy, when we speak about security, when we speak about politics? Is there a different way for women to talk about those topics? Do you feel that, I know that we've spoken on October 7th, that women have been less heard before, during, and after, and is that something that you feel in your experience, in your professional work, or do you feel that this is such a horrible thing that has happened to our country, that there's no difference, men, women, everybody works together? What is, we're talking about women's leadership in a way of, are you an exception, or are you just an example of, no, this is happening and we're just all together dealing with the same issues? What is your take on that?
So I'll say the importance, the imperative for there to be viewpoint diversity, from my perspective, not just external diversity. We've sort of forgotten what diversity is intended to ensure, right? It's not just about the fact that we look different. That's not necessarily diversity. It's actually viewpoint diversity. The challenges, existing paradigms, a little bit of what we spoke about at the beginning, of in many ways the ability to have anticipated an October 7th, including with a a captivity of two deceased soldiers, Hadar Golden and Aron Shaul, and two civilians, Avera Mengistu and Hisham Sayed, two civilians that were returned actually recently, and one deceased soldier, Aron Shaul, but all of them had been held there for over 10 years, and Hadar Golden, deceased soldier, remains in Hamas captivity. The understanding that viewpoint diversity was imperative, and I'll share from my own experience, for example, around the Knesset committee tables, that perspective, but also it's not just as a woman, it was also the legal perspective, right? If you do not understand that there are other war fronts, whether as a woman or a man, except that war fronts are often dominated by males, that's just the way it is. Wars are often dominated by males. And I have said over and over again that we are in the midst of a raging, unconventional war for public opinion that has been going on for decades. And when I would say that, those words in Knesset, and that war is actually the hijacking and weaponization of law, of international institutions, of human rights. When you say that to a bunch of military generals, they look at you and they say, that's not war. War is not that. And that is where viewpoint diversity is critical. And I'll say something else about women in leadership that I've experienced that might sound removed to some, and I don't like to generalize. But there is an element of actually changing your mind, meaning holding on to a conception or a paradigm or a guiding principle and hearing the other person, listening in a conversation that is critical to being able to transition from a faulty paradigm, a faulty guiding principle, to one that actually addresses reality as it is. I have found much more receptive listening in the women that I have engaged. I have found a lot of courage in women that I have engaged over the last 18 months to actually, in many ways, represent something that is anti the space or the place in which they inhabited before. I have found many, many women in progressive spaces. I mentioned Judith Butler, she's certainly not one of them, but I have found many women in progressive spaces looking at reality and much more critically analyzing what it is that is faulty about the space they inhabited, and more importantly, being willing to speak up despite the price that they may pay, whether it's a social capital price or a job or friendships and so on and so on. And the one more thing that I've noted over time is, and I don't like to generalize, but I do think that women have a much more collaborative understanding of leadership. So in many ways, that understanding that we need a team, it may be a small team that we can convene, but we need a team to be able to fight a war in a comprehensive way. There is something about the collaborative approach to leadership that is, from at least my perspective, a critical piece of our being able to create a proactive, if you will, strategy, including to fight this war of which the tsunami of anti-Semitism is just a symptom, but this raging eighth front of war that is raging across the world is going to need a much more collaborative approach to leadership than we've seen thus far.
Yes, definitely. The what you're saying is music to my ear and to the work that we're doing. And we're actually talking a lot about feminine leadership, which includes men and women. And I think that what you described is very much, a description of what is feminine leadership. It just so happens that more women are using the feminine leadership than men. But we are hopeful that some men will also join the movement and be more in this feminine leadership. And what you just said about collaboration and being together and about, having this ability of, asking ourselves questions and maybe even having the courage to make decisions is a great transition to talking about the conference that we're having in a week from now. You're going to be a keynote speaker. And I don't want you to say what you're going to say in the conference because I want people to come to the conference. But the idea of this conference was to bring women together, specifically Jewish women entrepreneurs, because they are already leaders and they have the courage, or they could have the courage if they have more self-confidence and if they know what they can do to help and to change and to take action. And so the last question I want to ask you, and we'll leave what you'll say at the conference next week on May 4th, but I want to ask you, what can us Jewish women entrepreneurs, but it could be any woman or any person, what can we do at our level to combat anti-Semitism? What is maybe a mindset shift, or what is maybe a behavior or a way to look at things, or a perspective, or even in our conversations with our friends and family, or as entrepreneurs, we have more influence, we have clients, we have people online, that follow us. What is the one change that you can give us to make so that we can participate, contribute to that fight against anti-Semitism?
So it's a very important question. And actually, over and over again, I found myself over the last 18 months, as I use the language of there is a raging war over and over, it means that each and every individual, women and men, young and old, are boots on the ground. Each and every one of us has a role to play. Each one of us has a circle of influence, understanding that it is not always fun to fight in war. In war, we lose friends, we lose lives. We have lost many, either figuratively or literally. And losing friends and losing a job and losing social capital, as I said before, is something that I understand is an inhibitor for people to lean in, even though they recognize something, at least minimally, is inverted, and begin to drill down and understand actually that we're living in a time of Orwellian inversions. The understanding that each and every person has not just the ability, but I'm going to say the responsibility to lean into those circles of influence and know that courage is contagious. You will be surprised that the moment that you speak up, there will be others in the circle that have felt uncomfortable. You will just be the first. That is something that over and over again, I've been not only privy to witnessing over the last 18 months, because yes, I can encourage, and I know that there's a price to pay, and each individual has to make those sort of calculations in their mind, what that price they're willing to pay is. But I can assure you that the 140% of the soldiers that ran towards the fire on October the 7th, October the 8th, and since then in the multi-front war that has been raging, have not made those calculations. They have made the decision that this is our time, that this is on our generation, that we have to lean in, and they have recognized how contagious courage is. That includes the students on the front lines of whether it's Ivy League universities or on streets that have taken the responsibility to learn, to know, and to champion the fight that they're having on campuses and are in the trenches, if you will, boots on the ground on that other front of war. And I encourage all of you, whether it is entrepreneurs, mothers, teachers, in whatever role, in whatever capacity, to actually muster up what is required for there to be hope. I'll quote again the late Rabbi Sachs, and then this will end. The differentiator between optimism and hope, saying the following: optimism is the belief that everything will be okay, but hope is the belief that together we can make it okay. In that sense, optimism is a very passive virtue, and hope is a very active one. And it doesn't take very much courage to be an optimist, but it takes a great deal of courage to have hope. And so I remind us that hope kept the Jewish people alive for thousands of years, and that we kept hope. I remind us that hope, Hatikva, is our national anthem, and that hope requires action and courage from each and every one of us in whatever circle of influence we have. And this is our moment and our call to action.
Wow, I love that. Thank you so much for ending with that, because that is exactly the goal of our conference, where, the theme is be part of the solution to support Israel and stand with the Jewish people, especially in times of crisis. And our goal is to give hope, not only to the participants, but to anyone who is going to be influenced by the work that they will be doing because of this conference. And I really take this opportunity to thank you for giving us your time now for the podcast, because everything you're saying is so important. People need to be aware of everything that has happened until now and continues to happen. And you are doing an amazing, amazing work. And we're so grateful that you're out there fighting for us. And you're right, this is the eighth front, and this is war. And and you are 100% right with the boots on the ground. And I'm hoping, I know that you will be amazing at the conference, and I'm hoping a lot of people will come and listen to you and the other amazing speakers that we have. Thank you so much, Michal, and we will see you on May 4th for our conference. And thank you
Thank you.
everyone for listening, and we will see you in our next episode of the Jewish Women Entrepreneurs and Leaders podcast. Thank you, Michal.